In the winter of 1941, residents of Philadelphia's Kensington district began reporting sightings of a barefoot girl no older than 8, silently wandering the cobblestone streets at dawn. Her feet bloodied from the ice left eerie patterns in the snow, always leading to the front of the Pennsylvania hospital. There she would stand for hours without moving, eyes far too old for her young face, lips twitching as if silently reciting something memorized. When approached, she spoke not like a child, but like a surgeon, describing procedures and anatomy with disturbing precision that unsettled even the most hardened men. Though 37 separate witness reports were filed that winter, no investigation ever followed. Buried in the municipal archives for over a century and uncovered only during a 1943 renovation, those reports bore a cryptic annotation, "Medical discretion advised." What happened to Sarah Montgomery behind the walls of Philadelphia's most prestigious hospital was deliberately hidden until now. But before we uncover the horrifying truth, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Stories like Sarah's were meant to stay buried, and the people responsible worked hard to keep it that way. Drop your city or state in the comments. You might be closer to the truth than you think, because Philadelphia wasn't the only place where this happened. This story will take you deep into the forgotten world of 1840s medical science, where the line between healing and harm barely existed. In that era, experimentation was considered essential progress, even if it meant sacrificing lives, especially those who couldn't fight back. Sarah Montgomery, an Irish immigrant child, was one such victim. In 1841, Philadelphia stood at the center of American medical innovation. The Pennsylvania Hospital, founded by Benjamin Franklin, was a magnet for elite physicians from Europe and beyond. The city boasted more medical schools per capita than any other in the country. But beneath this prestige was a brutal truth. In the absence of oversight, ethics, or consent, doctors operated with unchecked freedom. Kensington, where Sarah first appeared, was a dense enclave of Irish immigrants fleeing famine and poverty. These families lived in squalid tenements ravaged by disease and industrial accidents. Children vanished into orphanages and workhouses without a trace. In this environment, the poor were expendable, and to some doctors, they were opportunities. Dr. Cornelius Thorne, Philadelphia's most celebrated physician, built his reputation on controversial treatments for what were then called nervous disorders. His private practice on Walnut Street catered to the city's elite, offering cutting-edge therapies using imported mercury opium-based compounds and self-designed electrical devices. His methods were praised in European medical journals, and doctors from abroad traveled to Philadelphia just to observe him. But Thorne's fame masked a darker obsession. His letters, preserved in the archives of the College of Physicians, reveal a man convinced that medical progress required moral sacrifice. In a letter to a colleague in Heidelberg, he wrote, "Healing on a grand scale demands sacrifices individuals cannot comprehend." His experiments on childhood psychological disorders, experiments requiring dozens of young subjects, were never questioned. But where did he find so many children? Sarah's parents, Bridget and Seamus Montgomery, arrived in Philadelphia in 1840 aboard the Celtic Dawn. They carried nothing but their daughter and the hope of escaping the starvation and disease that had already claimed most of their family in Ireland. They had no idea their American dream would lead them straight into a nightmare orchestrated by the very institution they believed would heal them. Seamus Montgomery found grueling work in the textile mills along the Schuylkill River, laboring long hours for wages barely enough to rent a single room. His wife, Bridget, took in laundry from the wealthy homes of Society Hill, scrubbing garments in freezing water until her hands bled through the winter. They lived in a cramped Kensington boarding house owned by Mrs. Agnes Kellerman, a Prussian immigrant with a shadowy past tied to her late husband's political troubles, details she never fully disclosed. Mrs. Kellerman kept detailed records of her tenants' jobs, health, family ties, and finances. These meticulous notes would later become critical in exposing the systematic targeting of immigrant children like Sarah. The winter of 1840 to 1841 was brutally cold, with temperatures plummeting and snow burying the unpaved streets, cutting off entire neighborhoods for weeks. Seamus developed a worsening cough from cotton fibers in the mill, what we now know as brown lung disease. As his health failed and medical costs mounted, the Montgomerys, like many immigrant families, faced an impossible decision: relinquish custody of their child to one of the city's charitable institutions in exchange for promises of food, shelter, education, and medical treatment. These institutions, operated under religious or medical banners, were in truth part of a disturbing pipeline. They funneled vulnerable children into experimental programs that supported Philadelphia's rise as a medical capital, but relied on subjects who couldn't resist escape or seek justice when things went wrong. On the morning of January 15th, 1841, Agnes Kellerman made her usual rounds. But Sarah Montgomery's room was empty. Her few belongings, a wool doll, a wooden cross from her grandmother, and the dress she wore from Ireland, were gone. On the table lay a note elegantly written and clearly not from working-class hands. Preserved in Kellerman's personal archives, the message read, "The child Sarah Montgomery has been placed in proper medical care for her own welfare and advancement. The family's outstanding debts for medical services rendered to Seamus Montgomery are hereby considered satisfied in full. Further inquiries regarding this placement are neither necessary nor advisable." The note bore a seal, allegedly from the Philadelphia Medical Society. But no such organization existed then or now in any official records. Bridget's screams that morning echoed through the boarding house, drawing neighbors from blocks away. Witnesses said her wails continued for hours until city constables intervened. She claimed men in dark coats had come in the night, speaking softly with Seamus while she pretended to sleep, and that she'd heard her husband weeping after they left. Pressed for details, Bridget admitted she and Seamus had signed documents they couldn't read, desperate, terrified, and clinging to the hope that Sarah would return once their fortunes improved. But when they searched the city, every hospital, orphanage, and religious institution, they were met with blank stares and denials. There were no records of Sarah Montgomery. None. Even the official-looking documents they'd received meant nothing. When Bridget tried to report her daughter missing, city officials dismissed her. If the child had been placed under medical care with parental consent, they said it didn't qualify as a disappearance, and without a lawyer, there would be no further action. But Sarah hadn't vanished due to debt or miscommunication. She had been taken. Dr. Cornelius Thorne, alongside a select group of Philadelphia's most ambitious physicians, had formed a secret organization they called the Society for the Advancement of Neurological Science. It operated in complete secrecy, acquiring immigrant children under the guise of charity and education. These children were used in experiments designed to manipulate the mind, alter behavior, and explore what Thorne called cognitive restructuring, a clinical term masking psychological trauma, pharmaceutical testing, and chemical conditioning. The society operated through a carefully constructed web scouts who identified desperate families, legal intermediaries, who drafted fake but official-looking paperwork, and hidden clinics disguised as factories in the city's industrial district. These weren't hospitals. They were labs, unregulated, undisclosed, and unforgiving. The operation was funded through a careful web profits from Dr. Thorne's private practice donations from wealthy clients. Eager to access his refined therapies and payments from European medical schools, who paid handsomely for detailed case studies, no questions asked. Sarah Montgomery was taken that January night to a secret facility hidden beneath an abandoned warehouse near the Philadelphia port. Once used to store imported textiles, the building now served a far darker purpose. On paper, it belonged to the Delaware Medical Supply Company, a shell corporation that existed only in legal filings. In reality, it was the society's main laboratory. Inside the facility was outfitted with crude surgical theaters, chemical preparation rooms, and small holding cells disguised as children's bedrooms. Here, children were subjected to experiments involving measured doses of mercury laudanum and other compounds. Their reactions logged meticulously in leather-bound journals. Every emotional outburst, physical response, and psychological shift was tracked, sometimes over months, even years. Thorne's methods were borrowed and adapted from correspondence with European doctors conducting similar work on prisoners and political dissidents. But children with their pliable minds and limited legal protections were ideal subjects for his more ambitious goals. In his records, Sarah was listed as Subject S41. Her intake notes described a healthy 8-year-old with normal cognition and emotional responses, no trace of the disorders Thorne aimed to induce or eradicate. But something about her stood out. Notes hidden behind a false wall in Thorne's Walnut Street office, uncovered decades later, revealed his fixation with Sarah's memory and her uncanny ability to absorb complex information. He believed she was the ideal subject for his most extreme experiments, what he called accelerated cognitive restructuring. The basement facility where Sarah was held was Thorne's masterpiece. Designed to eliminate outside interference, it featured soundproofed walls, adjustable artificial lighting to disrupt sleep patterns, and a ventilation system that allowed chemical vapors to be introduced during conditioning sessions. It was a controlled environment, perfect for manipulating the mind. In the weeks after Sarah disappeared, strange rumors began to surface across Philadelphia's medical community. At first dismissed as stress or superstition, the reports soon revealed disturbing patterns. Night shift orderlies at Pennsylvania Hospital whispered of hearing children's voices echoing from locked basement levels. Voices calmly reciting medical terminology and anatomical details far beyond their years. Nurses discovered surgical tools laid out like toys, scalpels arranged like dolls, forceps forming letters, bandages tied in intricate knots with uncanny precision. Most unsettling were the accounts from medical students. Several claimed to glimpse a small girl sitting in the back of lecture halls, silently taking notes. She never spoke, but when professors made mistakes, she would subtly shake her head, or in rare cases, whisper the correct term. Every report described the same figure, a young girl with eyes far too old, appearing only in peripheral vision. And always after she vanished, the faint smell of mercury and laudanum lingered behind. Faculty dismissed these incidents as hallucinations, symptoms of exhaustion and academic stress. But the consistency of the sightings and the accuracy of the girl's corrections unsettled even the most skeptical instructors. While these reports trickled through the city, Thorne's research continued. Winter deepened, and with it the experiments intensified. Thorne's experimental logs reveal a chillingly systematic approach to psychological manipulation. An early blend of what we now recognize as classical conditioning, pharmaceutical dependency, and behavioral control. Written in coded Latin, interwoven with numerical sequences representing drug dosages and timing intervals. His notes detail Sarah Montgomery's responses with the clinical detachment of someone studying test animals, not children. His protocol followed a calculated progression, developed through prior experiments on adult subjects. First, he established baseline behavior through exhaustive observation and testing. Then came graduated doses of mercury to measure neurological degradation and cognitive shifts. Opium derivatives followed to study pain tolerance and mental pliability. Finally, he introduced chemical combinations designed to induce what he called controllable associative states conditions, where a subject could be programmed to respond to specific stimuli with predictable behaviors. Sarah's transformation was documented with unsettling precision. At first, she exhibited entirely normal responses: fear, confusion, crying for her parents, and attempts to resist. But as the chemical effects mounted, her behavior began to change in ways that surpassed even Thorne's ambitions. Within 6 weeks, she could recite complex medical terminology, flawlessly identify surgical instruments by touch even while blindfolded, and demonstrate a functional understanding of procedures that startled Thorne's most experienced associates. Most disturbingly, she began exhibiting what Thorne called empathic dissociation, the ability to analyze her own suffering with detached objectivity while remaining aware of the pain being inflicted. She became both subject and observer, victim and collaborator, simultaneously enduring and documenting her own abuse. Back in Kensington, Mrs. Agnes Kellerman was not idle. Driven by a mix of maternal concern and painful memories of authoritarian medicine in Prussia, she launched her own quiet investigation. Her methodical habits, honed during her late husband's work as a political organizer, led her to document every official lie, every bureaucratic dead end, every vague denial. She uncovered a pattern too consistent to ignore. Immigrant families across the district had reported similar disappearances over the past 3 years. The stories followed a now familiar script: visits from well-dressed men who spoke of medical care and educational advancement documents the families couldn't read, but felt compelled to sign, and children who vanished without a trace. There were no records, no follow-ups, and no legal recourse. Kellerman's personal history witnessing medical atrocities inflicted on political prisoners made her especially sensitive to the signs of institutional abuse masquerading as benevolence. Her bilingual notes, written in both English and German to shield them from casual readers, would one day serve as crucial evidence when investigators finally confronted Philadelphia's hidden atrocities. Meanwhile, more children disappeared. The Flanagan boy, age 7, vanished after his parents were told he'd be enrolled in a prestigious boarding school. The Kowalski twins, 9 and 10, never returned from a supposed medical assessment. 6-year-old Emily Riley was taken after her mother was persuaded that treatment could cure her chronic nightmares. All families had been promised care, hope, and a future for their children. All had unknowingly signed away their rights. The facility that received these children had been twisted into a grotesque mimicry of a real institution, complete with libraries, classrooms, and surgical theaters. On the surface, it looked like a center for healing and learning. In truth, it was a place of conditioning, manipulation, and long-term experimentation. Children were taught to observe each other, assist in procedures, take notes, and respond clinically to trauma. Compliance earned small rewards, better meals, warm clothes, access to books, and the ever-present promise that good behavior would reunite them with their families. The psychological conditioning was so effective that many began to believe they were contributing to something noble. Victims became unwitting collaborators. Thorne documented their transformation with satisfaction. To him, the results validated his methods. As spring arrived and Philadelphia's elite returned to society life, Thorne found himself in a paradox. Wealthy parents, some of whom indirectly funded his work, now requested treatments for their own children's behavioral issues, academic struggles, disobedience, emotional disturbances. Ironically, they sought the very knowledge he had gained by mutilating children like Sarah. In gentler forms, his brutal experiments became fashionable therapies. In private letters to his research partner, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, Thorne struggled with the ethical contradiction. "I find myself in the peculiar position of healing the children of those who would condemn me if they knew the source of my knowledge," he wrote. Yet science advances through sacrifice. If the suffering of a few can relieve the suffering of many, can we not justify the methods by the outcomes? Sarah Montgomery became his most successful and most disturbing subject. After months of chemical exposure and psychological reprogramming, she developed what Thorne termed adaptive dissociation, the deliberate formation of multiple behavioral states. During experiments, she displayed the cold precision of a trained physician, taking notes on her own reactions, offering suggestions to improve data collection, even critiquing procedural methods. Outside those sessions, she performed the role of a child. She asked for dolls, hummed songs, played games, and expressed affection toward the very people who had broken her. But her behavior always seemed deliberate, like she was acting a part. The real Sarah, the child who once cried for her parents, had receded behind layers of constructed identities. And the deeper Thorne pushed, the more uncertain he became about who or what he had created. Sarah Montgomery's ability to compartmentalize her trauma marked the psychological breakthrough Thorne had long pursued. But the cost of that achievement, one increasingly visible in her blank stares and unnatural composure, was becoming hard to ignore even for him. By spring 1841, the number of children held in the facility had grown to nearly 15. And something had shifted. The others began to fear Sarah, not openly and not in ways they could explain, but in quiet glances, nervous silences, and subtle avoidance. She anticipated Thorne's experiments before they were announced, preparing herself with a precision that suggested not just understanding, but participation. More troubling still, she had begun assisting in procedures on other children. She administered medication, collected data, and even soothed younger captives while documenting their pain in sterile detail. Her demeanor blended childlike curiosity with clinical detachment. To Thorne's assistants, many of whom had grown numb to the horror, Sarah was deeply unsettling. A victim who had become an instrument. Dr. Edmund Hartwell Thorne's longtime collaborator and co-founder of the clandestine society, began to express deep reservations. His personal correspondence, discovered after his death in 1847, revealed a man haunted by what they had created. In a letter to his brother, dated April 3, 1841, he wrote, "The Montgomery child has developed capacities that exceed anything we anticipated. Her cognitive abilities now rival those of our most advanced students. Yet her emotional states flicker unnervingly between artificial innocence and analytical detachment. I fear we have induced changes beyond our control. We've altered her in ways that neither science nor conscience can resolve. And I now question whether the pursuit of knowledge can justify the permanent dismantling of the minds we've touched." Outside the laboratory walls, the silence was beginning to break. Philadelphia's growing movement for reform, led by advocates concerned with immigrant welfare and child protection, began to notice the pattern of disappearances. Though the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children would not be formally established for decades, its spirit lived on in early activists like Rebecca Stanwood, a young Quaker woman with abolitionist roots. Stanwood had turned her moral convictions toward the plight of missing children. She began methodically tracking cases from the Kensington district, compiling interviews, maps, timelines, and public records. Her investigation revealed something far more sinister than scattered misfortunes, a pattern of systematic disappearance, institutional obstruction, and calculated indifference. Her work led her to Mrs. Agnes Kellerman, whose background and multilingual skills proved invaluable in reaching frightened, non-English-speaking families. Together, the two women formed a quiet alliance, mapping abductions across neighborhoods and ethnic lines. What emerged was chilling in its consistency. The missing children were all from impoverished families, all displayed high intelligence or learning aptitude, and all had been approached by the same network of smooth-talking, well-dressed men. Each case followed the same arc: promises of care or education, official-looking paperwork, and then silence. By summer 1841, the facility had expanded again. Nearly 20 children were now housed in the warehouse's basement. The space no longer resembled a makeshift clinic. It had become a fully operational research complex. Multiple surgical suites had been constructed. A growing pharmaceutical lab operated around the clock. Record-keeping stations were staffed by conditioned children. And the once homey rooms now resembled dormitories, cold-efficient and unmistakably designed for long-term containment. Thorne's experiments had escalated. No longer confined to chemical conditioning and cognitive tests, he began what he called behavioral modification through controlled trauma, a program that subjected children to finely measured physical and psychological stress. The aim was not simply to hurt them, but to reshape them to destroy natural resistance to authority and instill a heightened capacity for absorbing complex information under extreme pressure. Each child was pushed to the edge of endurance. Those who complied were rewarded. Those who resisted were broken. And at the center of it all was Sarah Montgomery, no longer just a subject, but a creation. Inside the facility, daily life had evolved into a carefully engineered system of control. The children followed a rigid routine that blended traditional education, medical experimentation, and subtle psychological manipulation. Mornings were spent learning reading, writing, and arithmetic, standard lessons on the surface, but laced with advanced medical terminology and anatomical concepts designed to prepare them for their roles as subjects and assistants in Thorne's experiments. Afternoons shifted into procedures. Children administered injections, monitored vital signs, kept meticulous logs of symptoms and responses, and offered emotional support to one another during traumatic treatments. All the while, they remained under the influence of carefully measured pharmaceutical regimens that dulled fear and blunted emotional reflexes. Over time, normal childhood reactions, grief, panic, empathy, were systematically overwritten. Sarah Montgomery was no longer just Thorne's most successful subject. She had become a vital instrument in his operation, a child capable of executing complex medical tasks with the precision of a trained doctor, while still presenting enough childlike warmth to comfort and manipulate her peers. Her transformation was both the crown jewel of Thorne's research and the most damning evidence of its inhumanity. She now conducted psychological assessments of new arrivals, prepared pharmaceutical compounds for experiments, and served as a bridge between the adult researchers and the other children, explaining procedures, translating medical terms into language the younger ones could grasp, and preparing them mentally for what was to come. Most disturbing was her display of what Thorne called empathic detachment. She could provide sincere emotional comfort during the very procedures she helped inflict, while simultaneously recording clinical observations for research. This dual-role victim-observer and collaborator was the psychological breakthrough Thorne had always pursued. But even he began to sense the cost. The final rupture came in late July with the death of 6-year-old Stanisław Kowalik. Stanisław was not an accident. His death was the result of Thorne's threshold research, a series of trials designed to determine the precise dosage at which substances became lethal. These experiments relied on pushing subjects past the limits of human endurance in pursuit of what Thorne termed therapeutic windows for future use. His notes recorded the child's deterioration with cold clinical precision, each stage of organ failure logged. Each seizure timed, each convulsion annotated with suggestions for improving methodology in future tests. Sarah witnessed the entire process. What disturbed Thorne was not the death itself, he had long since accepted such outcomes as necessary, but Sarah's reaction. She did not weep panic or even look away. Instead, she examined the boy's body, took notes, and asked advanced questions about the biological mechanisms of his death. She even proposed experimental modifications to prevent similar fatalities. Thorne wrote in his private journal, "Subject S41 has achieved a level of dissociative adaptation beyond our theoretical projections. The death of subject P17 elicited clinical curiosity combined with active emotional engagement. I question whether we have created a medical practitioner within the mind of a child or something entirely new in human psychology." For Dr. Edmund, Edmund Hartwell, this moment marked the line he could no longer cross. He had participated in the project for years, rationalizing each stage as necessary for scientific advancement. But Stanislas's death and Sarah's reaction to it shattered those justifications. Quietly, Hartwell turned against the project. He began collecting evidence not for science, but for justice. In secret, he sketched diagrams of the facility copied. Thorne's research notes, photographed living conditions using primitive daguerreotype technology, and compiled detailed records of each child's physical and psychological deterioration. He documented everything: protocols, personnel schedules, escape routes. And he began to plot their rescue. The opportunity came in August, when Hartwell learned that city health officials were planning a port-side inspection following reports of cholera outbreaks. He realized this could serve as cover for exposing the facility. In preparation, he reached out to Rebecca Stanwood and Mrs. Kellerman, supplying them with everything he had: names, descriptions, medical records, legal documents. Enough to make denial or suppression impossible, even within Philadelphia's notoriously corrupt political system. But timing was everything. Thorne had grown increasingly paranoid, instituting strict security protocols, keeping dossiers on local officials, and drafting plans for destroying evidence and silencing witnesses if discovery became imminent. On the morning of August 3rd, 1841, as inspectors approached the warehouse under the guise of a public health investigation, Thorne panicked. Rather than face ruin and prosecution, he made a horrific decision. He prepared a mass euthanasia. Mixing lethal doses of laudanum and mercury, he intended to inject every child under his care, documenting their deaths as casualties of a sudden cholera outbreak. His plan was to claim that he had operated a charitable medical refuge for sick immigrant children, only to be tragically overwhelmed by the disease. The press would hail him as a hero. The records would be destroyed. The witnesses silenced forever. But Sarah Montgomery saw through him. Months of conditioning had made her an expert on Thorne's behaviors, methods, and formulations. She recognized the compound preparations. She noticed the procedural deviations. And she understood instantly that Thorne intended to kill them all. Her chemically restructured mind, trained to dissect procedures with dispassionate accuracy, recognized instantly what Thorne was preparing. The scent, the formulation, the intent, it was unmistakable. Laudanum laced with concentrated mercury calibrated for lethality. He intended to erase every trace of his crimes by silencing the children forever. What happened next would haunt every surviving child for the rest of their lives. Though their testimonies were dismissed for decades as trauma-induced fantasies, the truth eventually emerged. And when it did, the full horror of that day finally came to light. Sarah Montgomery, the 8-year-old who had been transformed into something between captive and collaborator, made a choice. One that would save the lives of nearly 20 children, but shatter whatever remnants remained of her own childhood. Just when you think this story couldn't go darker, it does. If you're still with us and you're feeling chills, share this video with someone who appreciates the unsettling truths history tried to bury. Hit like to support this channel and subscribe, because the ending of Sarah's story will disturb you in ways you won't forget. Let's continue. As Dr. Cornelius Thorne prepared his injections in the lab's dim fluorescent light, Sarah approached him. Calm, measured, focused. Her voice, shaped by months of pharmaceutical programming and scientific indoctrination, delivered the kind of language that Thorne had spent months drilling into her mind. But this time it wasn't regurgitation. It was mastery. She described the effects of the compound he'd prepared down to the minute. The stages of poisoning, sedation, respiratory paralysis, cardiac arrhythmia, and death by asphyxiation. Then she described something else: what would happen after. How investigators would detect the opium's odor lingering in the air. how chemical burns in the children's throats would suggest forced ingestion, how Mrs. Kellerman had already given law enforcement exact descriptions of every missing child, making even disfigured bodies identifiable. And for the first time, Thorne froze not from guilt, but because she saw something he had missed. Because she was smarter than him now. But Sarah's motivation wasn't heroism. Her transformation had created something far more disturbing than a child who resisted her captor. She was driven by curiosity, a cold, scientific hunger to observe human behavior under extreme stress. She wanted to see what would happen when the plan failed. She wanted to witness Thorne unravel. She wanted to record the responses of the other children during rescue. What followed was a chilling exchange that lasted nearly an hour. Sarah dismantled every piece of Thorne's plan logically, precisely, ruthlessly. She outlined the legal fallout, the forensic evidence, the investigative paths. And then she did something even more horrifying. She offered alternatives. She suggested ways he could improve the plan, hide the evidence more efficiently, use different compounds that would be harder to detect, destroy the bodies in methods less traceable. And she said all of it in the same tone she had once used to recite vocabulary words and anatomy lessons. With clinical detachment, the other children watched in silent terror. Some began to cry, not from fear of death, but from the unbearable realization that Sarah had become something they no longer recognized as human. Her presence no longer reassured them. It chilled them. When the warehouse doors were finally forced open and city inspectors flooded the basement with lanterns and shouts, they were met with a scene that defied belief. Thorne sat frozen in his chair, hands limp at his sides, staring at the small girl who had stripped him of his power. Sarah stood calmly among the children, explaining what would happen next. That they would be questioned. That some of their memories might be unclear. That the strange gaps in their feelings were a result of the treatments they'd received. Rebecca Stanwood's account, preserved in the archives of the Philadelphia Historical Society, describes the children as existing in multiple psychological states at once. Some cried and clung to adults, others spoke in cold medical jargon describing their symptoms like junior doctors. But Sarah stood apart. When questioned by investigators, she laid out the procedures in medical detail. She described the facility's layout, the experiments, the hierarchy, the drug interactions, all in precise technical language. So advanced, in fact, that city officials had to bring in physicians from the University of Pennsylvania to verify her descriptions. They confirmed it, every word. Sarah Montgomery was no longer an ordinary child. She was the most complete product of Dr. Cornelius Thorne's horrific ambition. Not just a survivor of medical abuse, but a living embodiment of it. And the cost of saving the others was her own humanity. And yet, between her clinical recitations of pharmaceutical interactions and surgical precision, Sarah would suddenly break, asking for her mother, crying over a lost doll, or becoming inconsolable over minor slights. Beneath the layers of conditioning, chemical control, and trauma, the 8-year-old girl still flickered fragile, raw, and irreparably fractured. A living paradox, both victim and something entirely new. Dr. Cornelius Thorne never stood trial. Within 6 hours of the warehouse's discovery, he was found dead in his Walnut Street office, slumped over his desk, from a self-inflicted overdose of the same mercury compounds he had used on the children. His suicide note, written in the same clinical tone that filled his research logs, contained only a few lines. Sarah Montgomery represents the most successful and most tragic outcome of our investigations into the malleability of human consciousness. Science demands sacrifice. But perhaps some knowledge is too terrible to possess. The story became front-page news. The Kensington children incident sent shockwaves through Philadelphia. But the official investigation lasted only 6 weeks, and its conclusions satisfied no one. City officials confirmed that 11 children had been recovered from unlawful detention and reunited with their families. But eyewitnesses reported seeing many more. Some said 20 or more children had been inside the facility. Several documented missing children were never found. No formal explanation was offered. The numbers didn't add up. The silence was deafening. The Philadelphia Medical Society publicly disavowed Thorne, labeling him a rogue operator. But his lab was filled with correspondence funding records and co-signed research that tied respected figures in the medical establishment to his work. The society buried it. City authorities hesitated to prosecute. And reform advocates, furious and exhausted, were left to document what they could while the system quietly closed ranks. The surviving children's reintegration into society was slow and painful. Many returned to families who no longer recognized them. Some suppressed their memories and lived quietly, their scars hidden. Others developed profound behavioral disorders, learning difficulties, and psychological trauma that 1840s medicine couldn't even name, let alone treat. But no case was as challenging as Sarah Montgomery's. Bridget and Seamus had come to Philadelphia dreaming of a better life. Instead, they watched their daughter return to them as someone unrecognizable. Sarah could describe every procedure ever performed on her or others, down to chemical dosages and organ response times. Her memory was flawless. Her vocabulary rivaled trained physicians. And yet, she was incapable of engaging in a simple conversation about feelings. She couldn't distinguish between comfort and observation, between love and assessment. She tried to connect with her parents, but often asked about their anatomy or described their emotional responses like symptoms in a textbook. Her understanding of humanity had been overwritten by protocols. The reunification was more devastating than joyous. Mrs. Agnes Kellerman, whose records had made the investigation possible, took a special interest in Sarah's recovery. Haunted by her past in Prussia, where she had witnessed medical tyranny disguised as science, she helped establish a small fund to support the Montgomerys and other families. Alongside Rebecca Stanwood, she also began compiling a report, an unofficial but detailed chronicle of what had occurred, meant not for the courts, but for posterity. They called it a record of the silenced, and it became the foundation for future reforms in medical ethics. The discovery of Thorne's facility shook Philadelphia's medical community to its core. Quiet conversations about oversight turned into demands for reform. While many institutions resisted the horror of the incident, began to influence medical education nationwide. Whispered references to the warehouse children crept into early debates on ethics, experimentation, and consent. Sarah Montgomery's name was almost never spoken in public again. But in academic circles, quietly and without attribution, she became a case study. Not in textbooks, but in hushed lectures and private seminars. A cautionary tale. The girl who had become a physician's tool. The child who had known too much. And while others moved on, those who had seen her, who had heard her speak in perfect Latin while crying for a doll, never forgot. Because Sarah Montgomery didn't survive what was done to her. She simply remained. The Kensington Children incident became a rallying cry for reform advocates who demanded greater oversight in medical research, the creation of standardized ethical guidelines and legal protections for vulnerable populations at risk of exploitation. But their efforts met fierce resistance. Traditionalists in the medical community insisted that Thorne's atrocities were an aberration, not a reason to restrict scientific advancement. For years, debate raged, but in the end, few concrete changes followed. No laws were passed, no oversight committees were formed, and the machinery of medicine rolled on. Sarah Montgomery survived. She grew into adulthood, but the child who had vanished in January 1841 never truly returned. The woman who carried her name was brilliant, precise, and emotionally distant. Her understanding of the human mind, shaped in the depths of that basement laboratory, made her invaluable to physicians facing perplexing psychological cases. Yet she lived on the fringes, consulted, but never embraced, studied, but never fully understood. She never married, never had children, never returned to a normal life. In her final years, Sarah wrote a series of memoirs, raw, clinical, devastating. Too disturbing to be published during her lifetime, the documents were discovered in the 1920s among the personal files of a Philadelphia physician who had once consulted her. They remain one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of early medical experimentation on children ever uncovered. Her words offered historians an unprecedented window into the psychological damage wrought by systematic trauma and pharmaceutical conditioning. The warehouse was demolished in 1847. Officially, it was condemned for structural instability. Unofficially, most believe it was destroyed to erase the last physical evidence of what had happened there. Today, the site lies beneath a parking lot in the Northern Liberties neighborhood of Philadelphia. Nothing marks it except for a small plaque placed in 1991 by the Pennsylvania Historical Society, exactly 150 years after Sarah's rescue. It reads only, "In remembrance of those who were lost and one who was changed forever." The lesson of Sarah Montgomery's story is not just about a single mad doctor. It's about what happens when scientific pursuit forgets the people it uses to reach its goals. When curiosity outruns conscience. When institutions protect their own at the expense of the innocent. The line between healing and harm, between research and cruelty, is thin. It was thin in 1841. And it still is. Sarah Montgomery reminds us that some knowledge comes at too great a cost. That the voices of the vulnerable, especially children, must never be drowned out in the name of progress. But what do you think? Do you believe we know everything about what happened in that basement? Or are there still secrets buried in Philadelphia's medical archives, locked away in dusty folders no one wants us to find? Leave a comment below. Tell us what you think happened to the missing children who were never accounted for. And if this story shook you, if you want more true horror rooted in the darkest corners of history, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the shadows of the past still stretch into the present, and we've only just begun to uncover them. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.